Hi, everyone. Hi. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Annie Lunston, and I co-lead the Boston Green Ribbon Commission's Cultural Institutions Working Group. Our working group is composed of roughly 35 of Boston's most well-known museums, green spaces, and cultural attractions. And our mission is to drive, organize, and support Boston's cultural organizations in equitable responses to the impacts of a changing climate. So today's program is going to highlight the collaborative work of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum and Boston's Institute of Contemporary Art on how to meet the carbon reduction goals and maintain complex environmental needs of precious collections. We'll be exploring challenges, learnings, and new approaches that we hope can inform the work of mid-sized art museums across the US and beyond. And for those of you not in the art museum game, perhaps shed a little bit of light on some of the unique challenges museums face as they work to do their part on reducing emissions. I am very happy to turn the program over to Kelly Gifford, the ICA's Deputy Director, and Holly Salmon, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum's John L. and Susan K. Gardner Director of Conservation. Before I do so, I just want to remind everyone that we will leave some time at the end of the presentation for questions. So please feel free to put them in the chat as they come to mind. And with that, I will turn it over to Holly and Kelly.
Okay. Hello, and a big thank you to the Green Ribbon Commission for having us here today. And thank you all for joining us. I am Kelly Gifford. I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute of Contemporary Art Boston.
And I'm Holly Salmon, the John L. and Susan K. Gardner Director of Conservation at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. In this context, I always like to clarify too that that's Director of Art Conservation and not Environmental Conservation. We've had the pleasure of working together over the past year on a joint project to better understand the climate and sustainability issues for mid-sized museums like ours. This afternoon, we'll begin with an introduction to our individual museums and the project as a whole, followed by a review of the biggest climate impacts produced by museums. We will touch on how local and international guidelines for sustainability affect us, and then dig into calculating carbon footprint for museums and addressing energy consumption and waste. Finally, we'll present our strategies, next steps, and also challenges. Isabella Stewart Gardner opened her museum on New Year's Day, 1903, constructing one of the first buildings in Boston's Fenway neighborhood and housing over 18,000 works, including paintings, sculpture, furniture, archives, books, textiles, and more. When she died in 1924, she left her collection for the education and enjoyment of the public forever. And that's a direct quote from her will. In Gardner's day, the museum had coal-burning furnaces and fireplaces to heat the building in the winter and effectively shut down completely in the summer. Comprehensive climate control was not installed until the late 1990s. And we continue to upgrade and update this system as much as possible within the limits of our historic building, which you can see in this image on the right. In 2012, we opened an expansion, seen on the left, designed by the Renzo Piano Building Workshop that is LEED certified gold for sustainability.
The ICA opened in 1936 as an extension of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Over the years, we have had many homes, and we opened our first permanent home in 2006 in the Seaport. The architects Stiller, Scofidio, and Renfro positioned the museum facing Boston Harbor, imagining the harbor as our front yard. Understanding the possibility of rising tides, but not to the extent that we understand them now, the architects did situate the museum's galleries on the fourth floor and main museum mechanicals on the roof. As we hit the 20-year mark, we face a few challenges specifically connected to the climate crisis in terms of museum operations. Before we jump into the why and how museums are adapting their policies to be more sustainable, we thought it would be helpful to give a broad overview of standard museum practices and policies. Art museums share a common purpose centered around caring for and at times preserving works of art, supporting artists, and sharing works of art with the public. A museum's collection are works of art that the museum owns, and these types of collections vary widely. From Isabella Stewart Gardner's personal collections formed in the 19th and early 20th century to the ICA, who didn't start collecting until 2006, with a focus on works by artists represented in our exhibitions. Both of our organizations organize temporary exhibitions. These are major projects which include borrowing works of art from other museums, private lenders, and artists on an international scale. They're also both of our museum's biggest public programs in terms of audience. They drive the public to the museums. Cost, exhibitions are very costly to put together and organize, and cross-departmental collaboration. Almost every department in a museum is working towards the institutional goal of an exhibition being a success. Special exhibitions also have one of the largest impacts on a museum in terms of our carbon footprint. Holly's going to go into this in more detail later in the presentation, but to bring it all together, highly regulated climate control is mandatory to fulfill a key pillar of both of our missions, to house and preserve works of art, whether it be from our own collection or works brought in for special exhibitions. The ICA and the Gardner are both part of the Barr Foundation's Art Amplified cohort, which is a multi-year initiative supporting artistic excellence, relevance, risk, and civic investment. As part of Arts Amplified, the foundation encouraged and provided support for cohort members to experiment with projects that address sectoral challenges best tackled through collaboration, which resulted in our partnership together to identify and share information on how mid-sized museums could work towards climate resiliency. As you can see here, we've outlined the four main areas that we focused on. In terms of research and analysis, the one thing I wanted to point out is that in Boston, museums face unique challenges due to regulatory requirements like the Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance, or BERDO, and the need for guidance on climate resilience strategies for the unique challenges that museums have to follow. Globally, the BIZO Group is an organization comprised of directors of some of the world's leading and largest museums, including the Louvre and the Tate. And they have issued recommendations for a new green protocol that most benefit large institutions. And what we did together was really trying to look at those BIZO Group green protocol recommendations, which offer incredible insight, but pose significant challenges for some smaller museums like ours. In terms of stakeholders, neither of our museums has a role dedicated to sustainability, so we brought staff from across departments who each are key to this initiative, from curatorial and facilities to technology and theater, to compare our policies and challenges, share information, as well as bringing in external experts that could be helpful to our goal. These experts that we brought in put together roundtable discussions for our group, and we identified two key areas that we wanted them to focus on. One was understanding our carbon footprint, and one was understanding how we could reduce energy even with the climate stipulations that we have to follow. And lastly, it brings us to today, where we're starting to share this information with our colleagues like the Green Ribbon Commission, and then also with museum colleagues in New England.
Thanks, Kelly. So let's review some of the biggest energy use and waste production impacts from museums. Light, temperature, and relative humidity can all have detrimental effects on the cultural heritage materials housed in our museums. Starting with light, it's important to know that exposure to light can cause fading, darkening, and other forms of deterioration. Ultraviolet light is the most harmful form of light and can be easily controlled. However, long-term exposure to visible light, even at low levels, can be just as damaging. Visible light is also the light that we need to see and showcase our collections, requiring a draw on electricity. Somewhat straightforward, although potentially costly solutions include using efficient LED lighting and limiting or eradicating natural light to stop harmful UV rays and reduce energy consumption, both from the light source itself or the need to cool a gallery warmed by the sun. Extreme temperatures can have an impact on artwork and also our visitors, requiring a target temperature to ensure people feel comfortable and welcome in our spaces. And perhaps the most challenging environmental factor is relative humidity. Fluctuating levels of moisture can cause organic materials such as the wood panel or canvas of a painting to expand and contract. It can cause corrosion to develop on metals, salts to effloresce out of stone or ceramic, and more. Keeping the galleries at a stable humidity, especially with the varying New England seasons, means that our HVAC systems are running 24 hours a day to maintain an appropriate balance for our collections. Now, in 1978, a book called The Museum Environment by Gary Thompson became the Bible for how to prevent damage from environmental factors in museums, libraries, and archives. With regards to climate control set points, the book stated that museums should maintain 50% relative humidity and between 68 and 72 degrees with only a slight variance. Adopting these specifications was not only the ethical thing to do to ensure long-term preservation of art, but it quickly became a requirement that museums had to guarantee in order to receive accreditation from important associations such as the American Alliance of Museums. As you can imagine, this meant that museums were producing high carbon emissions and low energy efficiency in order to meet these standards. As Kelly noted earlier, museums like ours typically organize multiple temporary exhibitions each year and occasionally then travel these shows to other venues. Each exhibition will have a new design or floor plan that is created to illuminate the story a curator is trying to tell. This results in the construction of temporary walls, custom casework, pedestals or plinths, and other exhibition furniture, such as interactive response stations, custom seating, and specialized mounting systems. So with each new exhibition, the design and need for new build changes often results in material waste. Most temporary shows will include works of art that are borrowed from other collections, bringing together pieces from all over the world to illustrate an exhibition's theme. These loans often travel great distances, especially if the exhibition is touring to multiple venues, creating a carbon footprint through transportation by use of climate-controlled trucks and planes. Security measures for high-value works will also include a courier who travels with the art on the same plane or truck or in a follow car. A courier will then return home after seeing works installed and come back again at the end of a show for deinstallation, meaning twice as many carbon-producing trips. And finally, the crates that are used to carry the art are often custom built from conservation-grade materials. These are usually discarded once travel is complete because it is typically years before an individual work will be loaned once again. When possible, crates are reused, but this depends on overall loan schedules and the lending museum's capacity to store empty crates. So again, in the loaning of works of art, we see both an expanded carbon footprint and waste production. To secure loans from other institutions, so incoming to our institutions and from other institutions and private collectors, a museum is required to create a standard facility report outlining its specific ability to maintain environmental control of its gallery spaces 24 hours a day. A lender may also have differing specifications for their individual works, whether it be even stricter climate settings to put an individual artwork in its own case, adding glazing or a glass covering over a painting that is then discarded when it returns, etc. As you can imagine, these details get even more complicated for loans that tour to multiple venues. Nevertheless, it is really imperative that museums operate within shared best practices in order to mitigate risks and to fulfill the requirements of the insurance companies providing coverage for loaned works. So here again, we're seeing further production of carbon emissions and low energy efficiency in these loans. With all that in mind, I'm going to pass it back to Kelly to review the BESO response to climate change and also how the City of Boston regulations affect museums like ours.
Thank you. In 2014 and later refreshed in 2023, the BESO group published the BESO Green Protocols, which are guiding principles to assist museums in adopting climate control solutions that are safe for both the artwork and the objects and enable museums to reduce energy consumption and carbon emissions. To successfully achieve these greener museum practices, there must be proactive and strategic engagement at all museum levels. BERDO is Boston's climate policy that requires organizations to report energy use and progressively reduce carbon emissions between now and 2050. Museums are under the category of places of assembly, which include everything from movie theaters and gyms to office spaces and churches. This categorization does not take into account the multiple functions of a museum building, including the strict climate control of galleries, which require HVAC systems to run 24/7. This is very similar to a lab. And if you look at the chart on the right, you can see that labs have their own designation with a much higher emission count. We can go to the next slide. Now we're going to talk a little bit about best practices for understanding our carbon footprint. This is where we brought in our expert for this roundtable session. This expert was Laura Lupton from LHL Consulting. She led the roundtable discussion on how we can understand our carbon footprint and how to address the unique hurdles we have and develop strategies and share resources towards meeting these benchmarking goals. In looking at the research and analysis that we just kind of went over in terms of our climate control requirements, our business practices of creating special exhibitions, our museum's mission of preserving artworks, it seemed during our discussions that this was the first area that we really needed to tackle. One of the most common frameworks used in BESO to understand one's carbon footprint or impact is to understand energy consumption in separate groups referred to as scope 1, 2, and 3, which you can see here. These different categories help us clarify methods of consumption we have varying degrees of control over, what areas we are exclusively responsible for, and which areas require broader collaboration with our external partners and energy providers. Scope 1 focuses on areas that we have direct control over. This is traditionally under the umbrella of facilities and includes non-electric energy use, typically for heating that occurs on site. This is often any business's greatest impact and also what is most closely related to BERDO requirements. Some of the biggest components of Scope 1 are the HVAC systems and building materials. Museums can evaluate and invest in many areas that can reduce energy on site, including upgrading the HVAC system, updating buildings with energy efficient windows, installing insulation materials to assist with reducing HVAC needs to heat and cool. Other areas can include reducing powered machinery, helping with employee commutes, and planting trees on site to assist with the removal of emissions. Scope 2 focuses on purchased energy through electricity for lighting and for steam, which our museums use in our HVAC systems for heating and cooling. Converting to all LED lighting, as well as better control systems for our HVAC and motion sensors in non-public areas such as office areas can have a big impact. Scope 3 is focused on energy consumed through the various pathways of our supply chain. As these elements are often not under our direct control, this is where programming decisions, such as how loans are handled and partnership decisions in terms of what contractors we utilize, can most affect our carbon impact. Working with contractors that have sustainable practices is paramount. We can work with shipping companies that offer carbon offset credits, or can assist in working with us on consolidated or shared shipping with another organization. We can also purchase consumable materials which are both sustainably sourced and which the museum can responsibly recycle after use. In these next two slides, I'm going to talk about energy audits. There are several ways for all of us to calculate our energy emissions, from energy combusted on site as well as purchased energy. Here we've pulled out Energy Star and the City of Boston, who both offer free audit calculators for tracking and monitoring emissions. Next slide. Carbon calculators have been developed specifically for the museum industry as well, so that material and ethical impact of the preservation and care of artworks can be measured. They give us a process to calculate energy consumption, to make informed decisions, and to formulate actionable objectives and goals in relation to saving energy and lowering emissions. They empower users to change their practices and behaviors. For example, the STITCH program provides a data calculator that contains all building materials commonly used by museums for designing exhibitions, in the construction of gallery walls to the creation of furniture and display cases. And they give comparable products with a lower energy impact. It measures different forms of transport, from CO2 emissions, this could be different types and sizes of vehicles, and calculates their effect on the carbon footprint so that educated choices can be made. There's also another data source, which is Julie's Bicycle, which allows museums to gain understanding from benchmarking with our peers and understanding new practices and the results of those changes. So we can put all of these things into action by creating a carbon budget. It's very similar to a financial budget for each of our exhibitions and for the building. That budget will respond to BERDO and BESO guidelines and provide guidance on limitations to carbon exhaustive processes. Climate impact reports from self-reporting arts organizations like Art Basel or individual galleries can help serve as a benchmark for establishing carbon budgets for projects of similar size and scale. But all of this will only work if our organizations make a commitment not to spend more than the allocated carbon budget identified at the onset of a project.
To help us better understand the updated guidelines and recommendations as they relate to loans, we consulted with Cecilia Winter and Teo Karafotius from the Getty Conservation Institute Managing Collections Environment Initiatives for our second roundtable. As I mentioned earlier, with the first publication of the Museum Environment book, there was growing scientific documentation of how a fluctuating climate can be damaging to works of art. However, through the decades, new studies began to show that the tight restrictions outlined in the last century are not, in most cases, necessary, and given the significant impact on sustainability, should be reevaluated. Studies carried out by climate and conservation scientists have shown that a wider range of set points is not detrimental to most works of art. The updated guidance offered by BESO and other similar organizations suggests that we can actually fluctuate between 40 and 60% relative humidity and 60 and 77 degrees in temperature. And I'll note that those temperature extremes might not be comfortable for visitors, but they do offer options for closed hours and art storage spaces. However, despite the updated guidance, we still see, I'm jumping ahead there, we still see a wide range of stances being taken by museums across the world, which makes it challenging to reach a consensus, and particularly difficult if you're lending or borrowing from an institution that has a different take than yours. In response, the Getty Conservation Institute's Managing Collection Environment Initiative aims to inform environmental strategies for collections by addressing research questions and practical issues pertaining to the sustainable control and management of collection environments. In order to demonstrate that fluctuations in the museum climate do not adversely affect most artifacts, they've carried out a number of very specific scientific studies. These included using macromechanical testing by making samples that mimic historic materials and subjecting them to processes of accelerated aging with elevated temperature and humidity, followed by careful analysis. They also looked at historic samples, evaluating aging factors that might have altered the properties of those materials using micro and nano indentation testing, a technique that measures the mechanical properties of a material on a very, very small scale, so not inducing more damage, by pressing a sharp, hard tip into the surface and recording the force and penetration of depth. And finally, they conducted acoustic emission testing, a method of detecting microfracture in wood. So as wood is perhaps expanding, contracting from reacting to relative humidity, by measuring elastic waves released during stress relaxation in the material. Directly monitoring changes in wood artifacts is particularly useful in assessing the risk of environmental induced change to objects. And as you might expect, the results of all these studies help to further prove that most objects can endure a wider range of set points. So in order to cultivate broader acceptance of these parameters, museums like ours need to consider and exemplify a more comprehensive approach to our loan agreements. Rather than just setting one standard for all objects, we can take an individualized approach, looking at the needs of particular pieces, the climate of a receiving institution versus our own, say sending something to Florida in midwinter, etc. It's also important to evaluate any overall risk in lending a particular work of art, including theft, the rigors of travel and shipping logistics, and other more serious damage than what may be caused by light, humidity, or temperature. Working together with conservators, registrars, insurers, and curators, we can find creative ways to reduce the climate impact of loans. There are many opportunities to reduce our carbon footprint, increase energy efficiency, and reuse materials, plus share resources between museums and reduce waste. Some examples include something that we actually saw rise during the pandemic, which was the use of virtual couriers. Rather than having a courier travel with loaned art, the host museum will assess the condition of an object upon arrival and installs it in the exhibition while the lender observes over Zoom. Other options include combining shipments, so two local museums can share a shipment together and share services, or utilizing bookend couriers, meaning a known courier that's local to the exhibition destination as opposed to traveling someone there. We can hire more energy efficient transportation and recycle and retrofit crates built for travel. In the galleries, we can encourage exhibition designers to adapt existing construction from one show to the next, reuse pedestals or cases, as you can see here in this image, or share them with other institutions, creating a consortium of exhibition resources throughout the city. We can also replace older lighting with LED fixtures, as discussed earlier.
So through our work together and learning from experts in the field, we have come up with 4 key takeaways for museums similar to ours in scope and size. Educating stakeholders is number 1. It is essential to ensuring buy-in on climate initiatives and mitigation measures. Both of our institutions are working with our directors and people, our colleagues across the organization, to develop a collective understanding of our goals. Before jumping into action, a carbon footprint assessment is necessary to identify areas of mitigation that will be most impactful for the institution and for the environment. Number three, and as Hallie just went over, the scientific research is out there to guide US museums to catch up with our peers in Europe and embrace the expanded guidelines for BISO. This will require agreement from not only the organization itself, but also the lenders and partnering institutions that we're borrowing works of art from. And lastly, working cross-departmentally and across organizations to understand how we can create a collective to recycle and reuse materials locally and also nationally with our exhibition partners. For the ICA specifically, we're in the process of developing and implementing some long-term operational changes that are environmentally sustainable. We do have a long-term plan for our HVAC and lighting systems that will focus on energy reduction and will implement additional action steps from energy audit findings. We plan to strengthen our local networks for the reuse of material to reduce waste and work with exhibition partners on sustainability expectations. We are also starting a new cross-departmental ICA Green Team to develop guiding principles and informed decision-making and integrate sustainability into our budgets. And externally, our goal is to work more closely with the Green Ribbon Commission, seaport developers, our peers across the city, as well as city and state officials to push forward climate resiliency efforts in Boston. Our biggest challenge right now are meeting Roberto requirements, which would include a major investment and change in our HVAC systems in a very short period of time, and having a way to pay for the annual fines that the Roberto requirements, those kick in this year, and funding capital projects. I would say that these aren't just challenges for the ICA, but they really are challenges for probably art museums and nonprofits across the country. We have it a little bit different here because of Boston's Roberto requirements, but funding capital projects and infrastructure systems, are pretty difficult to fund when you come to museums. You can see in our next steps here, you can see our next steps here. I won't read them all through, but I have to say that this collaboration brought forward with the assistance of the Barr Foundation has already had institutional impact at the ICA. I think that many people in curatorial were already working on initiatives, and by working collectively with the Gardner and across departments at the ICA, it's already changed the way we're thinking about climate action and climate resiliency within the institution and how we're really developing these plans moving forward.
Thanks, Kelly. Like in your curatorial teams, there are and facilities, some things that have been underway here. For example, in talking about expanding our set points, that's something that we've already done, and also making gradual adjustments through October and May as we prepare to better align with the extremes of winter and summer. We're getting close to upgrading LED lighting systems, but it is a slow process, and it sometimes means infrastructure changes in order to wire for low voltage settings. As I mentioned earlier too, our new wing is LEED certified gold, and some of that comes from systems like our geothermal wells. However, we still have big hurdles when it comes to our HVAC systems, especially being that this is a historic building and the challenges of replacing steam boilers in that kind of a building. Our exhibition designers are reusing and repurposing, and one of the wonderful things that's come out of the discussion with the ICA, again, is how we can collaborate on sharing exhibition materials that might suit a different museum, not just within our own organization. But we do want to expand our recycling center and compost options here, and we're working within a very limited footprint. So how do we keep meeting those needs within the space that we have? We've started to work, as the ICA has, in staff engagement and involvement by asking each department to set goals towards reduction of energy use and waste, and then follow up with semi-annual reporting to the staff and board. We encourage sustainability procurement and purchases, commute and travel options, and then just an idea of continuing to embed the mentality of what more can we do as a team as a whole for the museum. In addition, trying to incorporate climate action topics into both our programming and temporary exhibitions, and wherever possible, continuing to advocate for awareness of the impact on climate change through our work. In terms of challenges, like the ICA, it's the same big challenge that we have in terms of being identified as a place of assembly under Burdo. And while we definitely understand and have already benefited from the opportunity to work very closely with the city on how individual buildings or spaces are categorized, our path to reach the benchmarks for decarbonization further into the future remains somewhat unclear. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, we're just so constrained by the historic building, the limit of the campus footprint, and the continued need to maintain a certain climate to protect our collection, even as we're easing those restrictions. For next steps, we're planning how to also think about our offsite spaces, such as our greenhouses and storage spaces, and finding opportunities for implementing maximum sustainability. And then while this particular project and the discussion that we've had with you all today has been focused on mitigation, we know that with a dramatically shifting climate, both of our institutions must plan for resiliency in the face of extreme weather and rising waters. And this is an area where we see an opportunity for collaboration between the ICA, ISGM, and many other cultural institutions throughout the city. On that note, we're extremely grateful for the already well-established partnership with the Green Ribbon Commission Cultural Institution Working Group, as museums like ours continue to work toward a more sustainable future. We just want to thank all of our collaborators across both the ICA and the Gardner Museum on this last year of this project, as well as our roundtable hosts from LHL Consulting and the Getty Conservation Institute. We've all learned so much from each other over this past year and are looking forward to further collaborations. And finally, a huge thank you from all of us to the Barr Foundation. Their vital support through the Arts Amplified Collaboration Fund allowed this project to take shape and enabled our museums to explore climate solutions together in a way that would not have been possible alone. We're advancing collective learning and contributing to longer-term systemic change. And with that, we'll open up to questions, and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Holly and Kelly. That was great. So I am going to start off with a question that came through which dovetails with a question of mine. You both acknowledged the fact that there's a lot of difference of opinion around what environmentals could or should look like within a museum setting. And I'm wondering if you have any call outs of kind of superstars organizations. I know you've worked a lot with the Getty, but are there other organizations, either within the US or globally, that you would point out as folks who are really leading this charge and using their voice and perhaps their institutional might to advance this conversation? I'm interested in the institutions, but I'm also curious about vendors that museums use a lot, insurers, and also shippers and other sort of vendor partners who might be really helping this conversation along.
Thanks for your question, Annie. For museums that we look to, I mean, certainly places like MoMA, the Getty, are really making big strides and sharing a lot of information. You know, the Getty just hired their first director of sustainability, and she's been doing a lot and met with us actually too, to look at ways in which organizations across the US can collaborate and share knowledge and share some of these ideas about what even smaller or mid-sized museums like ours are doing to kind of meet these challenges. I think that locally, it's wonderful having the cultural institution working group because I've personally learned so much from places like the Science Museum, Historic New England. I think they're all really doing a lot, and everyone's so very open to sharing. I want to be a little, I don't know, and there may be some of our art handlers and registrars who can comment on the other question, although I want to be a little careful about promoting one group over another. Uh, but there are definitely organizations that are out there that are also focused on this. And that's part of the onus that we have in terms of finding who they are and working with them to try to better think about our purchasing and other issues like that. But Kelly, you may have comments as
Yeah,
well.
I was going to say, I have two of my colleagues, Charlie Crowell and Janet Moore here, and I was wondering if you all would mind adding, anything from your experience or the specific people that you've been working with.
Yes, I would say that Harvard Art Museums and the Portland Museum of Art are two institutions locally who have been championing seasonal variations with the HVAC systems. And it was a number of years ago that Harvard said, in asking for a loan, um, said that this is how they run their galleries with the variations so that their systems can run differently in the winter, when it's drier, and then in the summer when it's more humid. And I was at a conference recently where the registrar from Portland was speaking as well about their system. So those are two that come to mind locally. We do work with fine art shippers who, actively say that each truck and trip they're using plants a tree. They definitely, call out to sustainability values, right the way through to another fine art shipper who retrofits crates and comes back in and they make the crates, but then they come and they will um, adapt the insides so that they can be used for other uses.
Yeah, kind of following up on what Janet was saying, just thinking in terms of like shippers that we commonly use, a growing practice within fine art shipping is to include sustainability pricing in the shipping. I most directly have dealt with this from the gallery side of things. So let's say an artwork is sold and we're delivering it to a collector and they're paying for shipping, and we can ask a shipping company, such as a company I know, Cadogan Tate, for one, provides this, where we can ask them, here's the quote for the shipment, and here's the quote for the shipment plus a carbon offset. The thing about a carbon offset, though, is it's really on us to do our homework about what that actually looks like. Oftentimes, a carbon offset can just be paying a fee on one hand to a governing body. On other times, it can be measures that the company is taking within itself to employ sort of like sustainable practices, like what Janet was referring to, which is something that I know Maquette advertises a lot. Some of that we plant a tree stuff is literally planting a tree. Oftentimes, in terms of carbon offsets, these actually mean raising money to prevent certain lands globally from being deforested. So if for each provider, they handle it a little bit differently. So it really is on us to understand what that pricing means. Similarly, in terms of consumable materials, it's really on us in terms of what we purchase. For example, we all use a lot of sort of like PVA foam, like ethafoam or something, which is like chemically produced. There's plenty of organic foam alternatives that are either made from soy or from corn, various things. That being said, they tend to be substantially more expensive. So again, it's really about us in terms of picking and choosing where we can sort of apply those efforts. But a lot of these places are not necessarily going to advertise loud and proud exactly what these things are doing. So it really, I can't stress enough how much it is like each of our individual responsibilities to look deep down the pipeline in terms of like where these things are actually ending up.
That's great. Thank you all so much. Holly, did you want to add something?
Oh, I think a part of that question was also in terms of whether we've seen pushback from insurance companies or object lenders. And, Emma responded quite, well that often insurance companies anyway will listen to what conservators, curators, and registrars or independent evaluators are saying. And so I think particularly when it comes to speaking with insurance companies or other lenders, this is where we really can show what we're doing. To Janet's point, like being influenced by Harvard, just sort of saying, listen, this is how we handle the climate in our galleries. I think that's part of it, is just demonstrating that. And then also thinking very individually and specifically about works of art. We've been putting very broad set points and parameters on for these, but really it's object specific. And ivory is going to react very differently to climate than a stone work of art. And so we can really think very smartly about this. But I think setting an example is going to be the best way that we can step up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, everyone. I'm going to shift us over to a Lindsay Butler adjacent question, which I think will eat that question around the designation of museums as places of assembly, which is sort of specific to Boston. But I'm interested in having you talk a little bit more about why and how that's a challenge, whether there is potentially a different designation that should be applied to museums, whether it's its own, or I think one or both of you mentioned that labs is perhaps a more appropriate place for museums to live. And sort of connected, I think, is Lindsay's question about New York City, which has its own ordinances, and whether there is some comparison to be made, to your knowledge, around what designation or bucket museums live in there. So I'll open that up.
Yeah, I think the Lab Association is a great one that Kelly made. I mean, I'm quite literally in a conservation lab, right? It's what we talk about here. But overall, in terms of needing to maintain a climate, it's very similar to what we see in biology and scientific labs in and around Boston. Hospitals and other places obviously also are trying to utilize a lot of energy for the work that they do. Um, I think the other thing that's important to note that we alluded to is these are massive infrastructure projects for our institutions, and what it takes operationally to get those underway, both in terms of raising the funds to do them. We're not-for-profit organizations. In terms of what it means to implement something like that, it could mean shutting down our museum. I mean, the whole rationale for us existing is to be open to the public. And so putting these kinds of things in place is not really the flip of a switch, no pun intended. It really is something that is going to take a lot for our institutions to meet in a very short time period. When you think about it, when you look at that chart, these benchmarks are coming up very quickly, and it's hard to envision exactly how to meet them in that time period.
I mean, it would be just quite specifically, multi millions of dollars for the ICA to change its HVAC systems to meet BERTA requirements. And we also don't know if it's physically possible to do with our institution, considering that our HVAC system and boilers were put into that room when we were under construction and there was no roof in the building. The other thing that I would say in terms of categorization, we were not part that the city, we were not part of the discussion. No one asked us, what the requirements were of museums. We were just put in the place of assembly categorization. We have gone back to the city, not just the ICA, the museums, the art museums, to advocate for a different designation. And we were not given that designation. The next thing I think that we've been doing is try to advocate for a blended designation, which would account for the square footage of our galleries and the need for that lab-like climate control, and a separate designation for more public spaces, which can be regulated differently. And I don't know anything about the New York requirements. I don't know if anybody else does, so I can't address that.
We'll put a pin in that one. Thank you. I'm going to direct to a fairly specific insider question, but one that may have a short answer. In transitioning to the BESO protocol, have you been able to quantify energy savings and staff time?
I don't know that we have exactly, because it's been several years. Certainly with staff time, in terms of the BESO protocol for climate set points in the galleries, that was pretty easy to make adjustments to. I mean, it's just sort of slowly regulating the set points that you input into your HVAC system. So that's kind of straightforward. In terms of loans, it's a much more complicated fixture. And for instance, the topic of virtual couriers is a very divisive one. I think that it can be concerning sometimes for particularly valuable works of art to just sort of put it out into the ether and hope that it ends up safely at the other end. And I'm being a little bit facetious. It's not quite that straightforward, but it actually means that the borrowing institution ends up having to do the work of the courier. So virtual couriers have a benefit in terms of energy reduction, but that is a point at which you see a much greater increase of staff time for the borrowing institution, because essentially they're acting like the courier instead of the courier being sent from another museum. I hope that makes sense. But I think with loans, that's a little bit where we see that increase in staff time, but I don't know that any institution has quantified it yet. I know that there are definitely some in the US that since the pandemic only use virtual couriers and have just decided to completely remove any in-person couriers, and they might be able to quantify what that shift has been.
Thank you so much. I am curious about, I think, Holly, this might be more your territory than yours, Kelly, but I know many in our cultural institutions working group and perhaps others on this call in other corners of the Boston verse or beyond have historic buildings. And I'm just curious about whether you could touch on some of these carbon reduction challenges specific to managing a building that is arguably also a work of art, and sort of what that impact is on the newer building versus is more quickly able to adapt or accommodate,
Yeah.
arguably. So I wonder if you would touch on that a little bit.
It's an interesting question. In some ways, there's actually a tremendous benefit if we adjust our climate set points to better align with what's going on outside. We have less of a problem, for instance, with condensation. If we're trying to pump humid air in the winter when it's incredibly cold, especially with our building with a glass roof, we're going to have condensation problems. So making these adjustments actually did better for the building itself. And so it was helpful to know that it was going to be okay for the contents of the building, because really for the building itself, that was a good adjustment. What's different is, Kelly was talking about how their HVAC system was built in, into an enclosed space on the roof as a part of that construction. Similarly, there's a turn of the century, not anymore, but there was a turn of the century boiler put into this small room beneath some of our galleries. We now need to get in there to replace that, right? So it's logistically difficult, among other things. It can also be really difficult in a historic building, unless you're removing everything from that building. The shift as you're changing your HVAC system, how are you maintaining that climate while you're doing that work? And so that's one, we plan very carefully around what time of year that we're doing these kinds of works, we're monitoring things, but logistically, if it becomes a big project, what does that mean as a whole for both the building and the collection inside?
Thank you for that. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I wonder if one or both of you would like to make any additional comments on sort of the larger museum universe in which you sit. You've described a little bit sort of global interest and protocols. You've described the impact of being within a loan system. And I just want to sort of open the floor generally as we wrap up to any final comments around the challenges of you are not alone in this work, which is both wonderful and awful.
I think the one thing I would say, and then I'll pass it back to Kelly, is that the "we are not alone" is improving day by day. I mean, I think that we are all very, very aware of the climate challenge and how our work intersects with it. And so we're finding more and more organizations like ours trying to make these steps, and more that there's a sense of collaboration, right, and sharing. And certainly the GRC Cultural Institutions Working Group is one in which we find that. Um, Everybody's at different levels, right? We've already written our climate action plan. We looked to other museums for help with that. We are willing to share with that. And so I think the good news is that for the most part, we're seeing that people are really trying to figure this out. It's the figuring it out part that may be the challenge, right? But the sharing of information is there.
I agree. I think that, just working on this project with the Gardner has been so incredibly helpful, and working with members of our team, specifically like Charlie and Janet, and introducing experts to us has been really beneficial. I mean, it was during this that, Janet took the step of writing kind of the BISO guidelines within our AAM facilities framework. So we've taken concrete steps. I think that some of the challenges that, are upon us and that we face as nonprofits are always staff and budget constraints. And institutionally, I think it will be very important for us to make a decision that this is going to rise up on the priority list, with all the other priorities that we have. But I think that, this is really an important step for the ICA institutionally. And part of that, it has been very helpful to have the support of the Gardner and the Green Ribbon Commission as we move forward with this process.
Also, I will just say that the AAM, the Association of American Museums, that give us our accreditation as a museum, are actively backing seasonal variation and institutions who are putting that into their AAM facility reports, which is great news.
All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone who attended today, especially special thanks to Holly and Kelly, and to both of your organizations for doing such important, inspirational work. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie.
Thank you.